If you keep telling Claude Code the same things over and over, then you're most likely missing a CLAUDE.md file. And in this video, I will explain you how to fix that. We will cover what a CLAUDE.md file actually is, how to create it, what should be inside of it, things you should not add to that file. And I will also show you how you can chain multiple CLAUDE.md files in a meaningful way. First of all, the CLAUDE.md file is just a markdown file that is read automatically at the start of every session. So before you type in anything, Claude is already aware of the content of it. Think of it as an onboarding note for your project, but instead of giving it to a colleague, you give it to Claude Code. But when you do that, don't treat the CLAUDE.md file like documentation, because the CLAUDE.md file is not meant for handling a lot of content which is really specific to the project. It should only contain things that Claude can't already figure out by reading your code or your project content, because Claude is already capable of reading the imports, the function names, the file content, so you don't have to explain specifically what the content is itself. But things that are just either in your head, like for instance that you want to use Python instead of JavaScript, or you've created your own CLI for a specific use case and Claude is not aware of the commands, or if you're also following a specific naming convention for your branches, but also things that might be really specific to the project itself. So everything that is unique is something that goes into the CLAUDE.md file. And when you do that, it is important to understand that everything that is inside of the CLAUDE.md file is only advisory, so it's not enforced, which means all the instructions and the content itself is either kind of a guidance and nothing of that is deterministic. If you need something like that, then you're most likely looking for hooks and not for the CLAUDE.md file. So let's have a look into how you can create the CLAUDE.md file. And there are actually two ways. You can either create the file manually, so just add a CLAUDE.md file into your project. Or you can also use Claude Code for that, because there's a command which is in it, which you can use on an existing project. And when you do that, Claude takes care of scanning the code base, checks the file content, and then it tries to derive out of that content a proper CLAUDE.md file. But it doesn't matter if you decide to go for a blank file by doing it manually or using the existing command in it. You should treat both CLAUDE.md files as a starting point, because you will either update it immediately after the creation because something isn't properly documented, or if you notice that Claude starts to do things wrong which it did before correctly. So let me show you how both looks in practice. So right now we are looking at Visual Studio Code, and I've opened already a project which is for the tutorial. So it's inside the working directory, GitHub tutorials, and then CLAUDE.md. And as we can see on the left side, I already created several CLAUDE.md files. So if you want to create it, simply create a new file, give it the name CLAUDE.md. And the next time you open a Claude Code session, Claude takes care of discovering that file and also injecting it into the session. And if you don't want to write it by hand, then you can simply open a Claude Code session inside the working directory where you want to create the CLAUDE.md file. And the only thing you have to execute is the init command, and then Claude takes care of scanning the code base. And once it understood the project, then it will take the content and derive out of that a proper CLAUDE.md file. Where it gets really interesting is depending on where you start your Claude Code session, it will load multiple CLAUDE.md files depending on the working directory. As an example, let's say you have a CLAUDE.md file in your user directory, then this specific file is injected into every session, because what Claude does in the background is that it kind of walks up the directory and it will collect every CLAUDE.md file that is within that folders. To give you an example, let's say I open Claude inside of the project directory, then it will read the CLAUDE.md file from the project itself, but it will also load the CLAUDE.md file from your user directory. And another cool thing is that depending on what you're doing with Claude and when it has to discover new folders, as an example, let's say I'm working in the project folder and then I have in the folder A something specific about a client. And when I tell Claude Code, go into that folder, read that specific file, then it will also discover the CLAUDE.md file in that subdirectory. And also that CLAUDE.md file will be then injected into the session, which also means it makes definitely sense to have several CLAUDE.md files even for subfolders, because then you hand over Claude Code one file which is small and does not consume a lot of tokens, with the most important information about the subdirectory itself. which also helps you eventually to save tokens because Claude does not have to read the content of every file to understand what the content is about. Another cool thing is that Claude is also able to discover the CLAUDE.md files on demand, which means that if you're working in a project, let's say you are in the current working directory, which is project, and then you take Claude Code to discover a subfolder, and this specific subfolder contains also a CLAUDE.md file, and then Claude takes care of injecting that also into your session, which is also a reason why it makes sense to also add CLAUDE.md files into subdirectories, because you can summarize the content of the directory within that CLAUDE.md file, which is usually a really small file, and then Claude knows already what is the content inside of that project, which also means it won't spend tokens on reading all the file content in order to understand what is the content of the subfolder about. But there's one thing that is really important to know. Once you compact your conversation, then all the CLAUDE.md files which were loaded on demand will be lost. So let me show you how you can figure out if Claude registered multiple CLAUDE.md files. And for that, we will first start a Claude session in the root directory, which is CLAUDE.md. And if I type in memory, then we can see I have the project CLAUDE.md file, which is this one here. But I have also the CLAUDE.md file from my user directory. And if I now go into the subfolders, so let's say I go into A, B, and then also into C. And if I then open Claude Code, and if I then start a Claude session, and type again the command memory, then we can see I have the CLAUDE.md file from the project, which is in this case this specific file here because we are right now in the directory C. But we have also the CLAUDE.md files from the directory A and also B. But it is important to be careful here because the list here does not show the order of the way they are loaded, because the first file that is loaded depends on the working directory. So if I type in Claude here, then it will first of all discover the CLAUDE.md file from my user directory. Then it will discover the CLAUDE.md file from the project, then from the subfolder A, B, and then C, which is also one of the reasons why it makes sense to be really generic and global for the CLAUDE.md file in your user directory, because this file is injected into every Claude Code session, and it doesn't matter where you start Claude. So this is kind of the foundation, and it should contain rules that apply to everything what you do. So the rule of thumb is more global means more general, and the more nested, the more specific. So don't repeat yourself in typical rules or what you're working with, and use that CLAUDE.md files in nested folders about special information in order to make it easier for Claude to understand the overall concept of your project. Now let's talk about what you should enter into the CLAUDE.md file and what shouldn't be there. And I would recommend to include always things that Claude Code can't guess, as I said, for instance, a custom CLI, or for instance, also internal rules that only you know, or if you're also following a specific writing style or coding style, which is not the default, and you want to have it done by Claude Code itself, then you have to mention that as well. But also testing instructions, repo etiquette, like how you name branches, how you write commits, and of course, everything that is unique to your environment. As an example, let's say you have a virtual environment for using a specific Python version or in general packages, and you want to use that in your Claude Code sessions. Then you need to add that information to the CLAUDE.md file, because Claude can't guess that you're using Python, and it can also not guess that you created a virtual environment before. Now, what to leave out, which matters as much as what you should include. And I would recommend to don't explain common tools that Claude already knows, so you don't have to paste in a specific documentation about an API, because Claude most likely won't read it, because the CLAUDE.md file should be quite short, and instead you can also link to the documentation. Another thing that you also shouldn't add are things that change frequently, because otherwise you have to take care of updating the CLAUDE.md file on a regular basis. And the chances are quite high that you will also inject into every Claude Code session some content that is wrong or not up to date. Let's take a look into one of my CLAUDE.md files for a project which is using Claude Code and also BigQuery for analyzing data from the Google Search Console. So in this case, I wrote my own CLI for communicating with BigQuery, and Claude knows how to use that CLI in order to derive SQL queries. And the first thing is about the project itself. So it's a CLI written in Python. And as you can see, I also kept it really short here, followed by the architecture, so that Claude knows already where to look if I'm asking for something specifically. So let's say I have an issue with the authentication, then Claude knows it has to check the auth.py file. And as you can see, I also kept it really short here, so I don't add a lot of information about what we are using exactly and how that works internally, and instead only that the authentication is done in the auth.py file, and that it supports, first of all, OAuth2, but also service count authentication. Then I also added some key principles, so I don't want to have any hard-coded schemas because I also want to use that system for other tables. And for instance, also that the default mode is read-only, so I don't want to use Claude Code for updating the data, so I don't want to delete anything, and I also don't want to add anything. And then most likely the most important part, which are the commands, because as I said, this is a custom CLI, and unlike, for instance, the CLI for Git, where Claude knows exactly how to use it, this is something that is missing in the training data, so Claude cannot know how to use that CLI, which is also the reason why I added the commands which are used for using that CLI. And then also some core information about the configuration. So this project can be used for different tables. And there's also the capability of creating a dashboard out of that. And since I want to have that in my brand theme, I also point Claude to the place where the branding lives. And if we have a look into the raw file, then we can see that we have in total only 55 lines, which is actually really short. And also one of the requirements for the CLAUDE.md file. What I like to do is that when I have a CLAUDE.md file and I have to review that manually, because I also use Claude Code a lot for generating it, but I also take care of checking manually if it makes sense what was added by Claude. And there's one thing I always do, and it doesn't matter if I create the CLAUDE.md file manually or by using Claude Code, and that is for every single line that I have here in my file, I ask myself, would removing this cause Claude Code to make mistakes? And if the answer is no, then I will simply go ahead and remove that. That question alone will keep your file lean, but also token efficient. Now let's talk about a few concrete rules that you should keep in mind when working with the CLAUDE.md file. And I would recommend to first of all have a target which is under 200 lines, because this is also recommended by the official documentation, which means that if you have a CLAUDE.md file and you start a session, Claude takes care of reading the first 200 lines, and everything that is past the 200 lines is most likely ignored by Claude Code. So if your CLAUDE.md file is growing past the 200 lines, then it is recommended to split the content and pull it back again by using the import method. As an example, let's say you have some specific rules for Git, and instead of listing all of them down in the CLAUDE.md file, you can just reference that document by using the following syntax. And what makes also sense is to use markdown, so header and bullets, like I do it also in this specific file here. So we have here an H1, H2, we have bullet points, which are also nested. And one more trick is that if there's a rule that Claude isn't following, then you can also make it in uppercase, so then it's kind of more important. And this increases also the chance that Claude will follow your rules. But also make sure that you don't use it too often, because if you use it like everywhere, then it's hard to distinguish for Claude Code what is really important and what isn't. And if you have the feeling that Claude is ignoring something that is mentioned in your CLAUDE.md file, then you can check with the memory command if that specific file is also loaded into your context window. And when the file is loaded and Claude Code isn't following a specific rule, then you have to check the content of your CLAUDE.md file and eventually optimize it. And the last tip I would like to give you, and it's also, in my opinion, the best thing you can do, it is take your time, sit down and read the documentation of Claude Code, because the documentation is actually really good. It's comprehensive, it covers a lot of edge cases, and is definitely worth your time. And that's it already regarding this video. In case you do have any questions, feel free to let me know, and we will hear each other in the next video.